Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to really get our paws into a fascinating area of vet neurology today.
Yeah, always exciting to dig into some cutting-edge imaging tech, right?
Absolutely, especially for our listeners dealing with those head-scratcher neuro cases. Today, it's all about quantitative magnetic resonance imaging, QMRI.
QMRI, yeah, it's about to be, well, it kind of already is a game changer. We're moving past those static MRI pictures and actually quantifying what we see in the tissues.
So less like a snapshot and more like taking measurements. How's that work in the clinic, really?
You got it.
Yeah.
Imagine with QMRI, we're measuring how water molecules flow through brain tissue. Tells us a lot about if that tissue's healthy or not.
Now, that's interesting. We're diving into a research paper today. It gets deep into QMRI and how it's used in diagnosing those really tricky neurological cases we see every day.
And this paper, it's no walk in the park. We're going to break down the heavy stuff, the different QMRI techniques, what's working, what's not, the whole 9 yards.
Sounds like we got our work cut out. So where do we even begin? What should we be zeroing in on when we're looking at QMRI in veterinary neurology specifically?
Excellent question. The research really hammers home this idea of standardization. See, in human medicine, skull size and shape, they're pretty consistent. But in our world...
We got Great Danes and Chihuahuas all in a day's work, right?
Exactly. So comparing their brain scans, it's like comparing apples and, well, you get it. That's why having standardized QMRI protocols for animals, how we get the images, how we read them, that's crucial, especially if we're comparing different studies in patients.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
Standardized protocols, got it. What else should we keep in mind as we navigate this QMRI world?
Another biggie is knowing the strengths and weaknesses of each QMRI technique. The paper really dives into several of them, and each one has its own quirks and uses.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Can you give us a quick rundown of some of these QMRI techniques and what makes them stand out from the crowd?
Absolutely. One that takes center stage in this paper is diffusion-weighted imaging, or DWI for short. Now, DWI, it's really good at showing us if something's changed in how water molecules move through tissues. And that diffusion, it changes when the tissue is damaged. Picture this. In healthy tissue, those water molecules, they're zipping around, no problem. But when it's damaged, say, after a stroke, it's like everything's jammed up, slows the water down.
So like those molecules are trying to squeeze through a tight hallway instead of an open room.
Exactly. And DWI, it lets us see these changes like we're looking through a microscope.
Yeah.
Now, one of the key things DWI gives us is something called the apparent diffusion coefficient. It's a mouthful. I know, we call it ADC for short.
Okay, break it down for us. What's so special about this ADC?
Basically, ADC tells us how freely those water molecules are moving in a specific part of the brain. Lower ADC means more restricted flow, could mean tissue damage.
So low ADC on the DWI could be a red flag for a stroke, things like that.
You got it. The paper actually talks about a study where they used these ADC values to tell the difference between how severe a stroke was in dogs, different grades of injury.
Wow, so they're not just seeing if there's a stroke, but how bad it is, just from how the water's moving. That's wild.
It really is. And knowing that helps us figure out the best way to help our patients. But DWI is not the only game in town. We've also got perfusion imaging.
Right, that was in the paper too. It's all about blood flow, if I'm remembering right.
You got it. Perfusion imaging shows us how well blood is flowing through different areas of the brain. Really helpful for spotting where blood flow is reduced, which can be a sign of all sorts of neurological issues.
Like a stroke, right. If there's a blockage, perfusion imaging would show us exactly where it is and how much it's affecting the blood flow around it.
Exactly. In fact, they talked about a study where they used it to look at dogs that they thought might have brain tumors. Turned out, perfusion imaging could help tell the difference between a tumor and something like inflammation just by looking at the blood flow patterns.
Wow, so it's like a roadmap of the brain's blood vessels, highlighting any traffic jams.
Perfect analogy. And speaking of roadmaps, let's talk about tractography. Now, tractography is like having a GPS, but for the brain's wiring. It lets us actually see those white matter tracks, the highways of the brain connecting different regions.
So we're not just seeing the different parts of the brain, but how they talk to each other. That's next level stuff.
It really is. And what's amazing is that tractography can show us tiny changes in these tracks, changes that we might miss completely on a regular MRI.
So we could be diagnosing problems earlier, even before they're really obvious. That could change everything for so many neurological diseases.
Absolutely. The paper even talked about a case study where they used it to assess a dog with epilepsy.
Now that's interesting. Makes sense though, right? If epilepsy is all about abnormal electrical activity, Being able to actually see those communication pathways could be huge for understanding what's causing the seizures.
Exactly. By looking at the white matter tracks, they found abnormalities that they couldn't see on a regular MRI, and that helped them figure out how to treat the dog. It's a perfect example of how qMRI can give us information that goes way beyond what we're used to.
Okay, so we've got DWI, perfusion imaging, and tractography. My brain's already working overtime. But the paper also mentioned something called magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or MRS. What was that all about again?
MRS. So unlike the others, which focus on the structure of the brain or how it's working, MRS lets us study what the brain is actually made of, chemically speaking.
It's like taking inventory, right? We can see what molecules are there and how much of each one.
Exactly. And this can be super helpful for diagnosing and monitoring a whole range of neurological conditions.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. One of the big ones is in diagnosing and grading brain tumors.
Because different tumors have different chemical makeups.
Precisely. Some brain tumors, they might have higher levels of certain metabolites, like choline, for instance. That can tell us how aggressive a tumor is. MRS lets us pick up on these subtle differences and tell one tumor from another.
Which could completely change how we treat them. That kind of accuracy is invaluable.
It really is, and the research highlighted a study where they used MRS to tell the difference between different types of brain tumors in dogs.
Yes, right.
Shows just how powerful it can be as a diagnostic tool and without even having to do surgery.
That's incredible. It's like MRS is giving us a glimpse into the brain's engine room, showing us what's happening at a molecular level.
I like that analogy. And this is really just the beginning. The more we understand about the brain's chemistry, the more we'll be able to do with MRS in veterinary neurology.
It's mind-blowing, really, to think we can look at the brain's chemistry in such detail and without having to, open anything up.
It really shows you how far we've come.
And from what I'm gathering, qMRI seems like it's perfect for those neuro cases that just leave you stumped.
Absolutely. The paper had some great examples. One that comes to mind was this dog kept having seizures, but they couldn't figure out why, not for years.
Really? What was going on?
So they did all the usual MRI scans, but nothing seemed out of place. But the dog's symptoms just didn't make sense. So they decided to try qMRI, specifically a technique called diffusion tensor imaging, DTI for short.
DTI, right? That's like the deluxe version of DWI, isn't it?
You got it. DWI looks at how water flows in one direction, but DTI, it analyzes multiple directions at once. So we can create these detailed maps of the white matter tracks. Remember those brain highways we talked about?
Yeah, like upgrading from a basic roadmap to a full-on GPS navigation system. DTI gives you a way better picture of how everything's connected.
Exactly. And with this dog, the DTI images showed these tiny abnormalities in the white matter tracks, things they never would have seen on a normal MRI.
So qMRI cracked the case wide open. They finally understood why this dog was having seizures.
Exactly. And get this. Once they knew what they were dealing with, they changed the dog's treatment plan, and the seizures actually got a lot better.
That's remarkable. It just goes to show how qMRI can be a game changer, not just for diagnosing these tricky cases, but for actually improving the lives of our patients.
Couldn't agree more. And that was just one example. They had more in the paper, like using qMRI to tell apart different inflammatory brain diseases in cats, or even to see how well radiation therapy was working for brain tumors in dogs.
The possibilities seem endless. But let's be real, this is some pretty high-tech stuff. What are the challenges, practically speaking, for vets who are interested in using qMRI?
You're right, it's not all sunshine and roses. One of the biggest hurdles is that not every clinic has access to the equipment or the people who know how to use it.
That makes sense. qMRI machines are no joke. And reading those images, that's a whole other skill set.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important for everyone to work together. Neurologists, radiologists, researchers, we all need to share what we know, come up with standardized ways of doing things, and make sure qMRI is used the right way.
It's about building a network, making sure everyone benefits from this technology, especially our patients.
Exactly. And that's where groups like VetNeuroJar come in, connecting veterinary professionals, providing continuing education, really pushing the boundaries of what's possible in veterinary neurology.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of qMRI, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? Those busy vets out there who are intrigued by this technology, but maybe a little intimidated too.
Don't be afraid to dive in and learn. qMRI is the future, and yeah, there's a learning curve, but the benefits for your patients, they're huge.
It's about staying curious, asking questions, and always looking for ways to expand your knowledge and skills.
Well said. Keep those minds sharp.
And on that note, from VetNeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.